In the gentle glow of a Disney movie night, millions of children around the world have fallen asleep to the sweet tale of Snow White. A beautiful princess, 7 friendly dwarfs, and a happily ever after that warms the heart. But what if I told you that this beloved bedtime story was built upon a foundation of horror so disturbing, so deeply twisted, that it would make modern audiences recoil in disgust? The story you think you know is a lie, a carefully sanitized, commercially packaged illusion designed to hide one of the most psychologically devastating tales ever committed to paper. Tonight, we journey back through the centuries to uncover the true story of Snow White, a tale so dark that even its own creators felt compelled to repeatedly rewrite it, desperately trying to scrub away the blood, the cannibalism, and the unspeakable acts of maternal evil that formed its rotten core. This is not the story Disney wanted you to know. This is the story that the Brothers Grimm themselves tried to bury. And by the end of this investigation, you will understand why some stories are too dangerous to tell in their original form. The tale we are about to explore emerged from the shadowy forests of medieval Germany, a world where death lurked behind every tree, and survival demanded a brutality that would horrify our modern sensibilities. It was a time when mothers could legally abandon their children, when public executions were entertainment, and when the line between fairy tale and nightmare was thinner than morning mist. But before we descend into this abyss of forgotten horror, we must understand how this story came to be sanitized in the first place. The Brothers Grimm, Jacob and Wilhelm, were not the kindly storytellers that history remembers. They were scholars, linguists, and ultimately editors who understood that raw folklore was too potent, too dangerous for the civilized world they hoped to create. Between 1812 and 1857, the Brothers Grimm published not one, but 17 different editions of their collected fairy tales. Each edition was a deliberate act of censorship, a systematic erasure of the original story's most disturbing elements. What began as authentic folklore, passed down through generations of German peasants, was gradually transformed into something palatable for middle-class families. Wilhelm Grimm, the younger brother, could not resist the urge to make these ancient tales more artistic, more appealing to their growing literary audience, but in doing so, he unknowingly committed an act of cultural vandalism. The original voices of the storytellers, the authentic terror and wisdom embedded in these ancient narratives, were slowly suffocated beneath layers of literary refinement and moral sanitization. The first edition of their collection, published in 1812, contained something far closer to the truth. These early versions were raw, unfiltered, and absolutely terrifying. They contained elements so disturbing that parents immediately complained. Churches condemned them as unchristian, and critics declared them wholly unsuitable for children. And at the dark heart of this controversy was a story that would become known as Little Snow White, a tale so twisted that it defied every assumption about childhood innocence and maternal love. In the original version, the story begins not with a wicked stepmother, but with something far more psychologically devastating. The villain was Snow White's biological mother, her own flesh and blood. The woman who had given her life was the same woman who would ultimately seek to destroy her in the most horrific way imaginable. This fundamental change from mother to stepmother was not made lightly. It represented one of the most significant acts of censorship in literary history. The Brothers Grimm, who held motherhood sacred, could not bear to leave intact a story that portrayed maternal love as capable of such monstrous corruption. But why was the original version so much more terrifying? Because it violated the most fundamental assumption of human civilization, that a mother's love for her child is absolute and unconditional. The story of a biological mother consumed by jealousy of her own daughter's beauty tapped into primal fears about family bonds, about the dark potential that lurks within even the most sacred relationships. The queen in this original tale was not motivated by simple vanity. Her obsession with beauty masked a deeper psychological horror, a narcissistic rage that could not tolerate being surpassed by anyone, even her own child. When her magic mirror declared that 7-year-old Snow White was more beautiful than she, it triggered something monstrous within her maternal psyche. Yes, you heard that correctly. 7 years old. The child at the center of this story was not the teenage princess of Disney's imagination, but a little girl who had barely emerged from infancy. This detail adds an additional layer of horror to every element of the tale that follows. The queen's jealousy of a child's innocent beauty becomes even more twisted. The huntsman's orders to murder what was essentially a baby become even more stomach-turning, and the prince's eventual attraction to what appears to be a dead child introduces undertones so disturbing that modern audiences would demand immediate investigation. But the true horror was yet to come, when the queen summoned her huntsman and ordered him to take the child into the forest. Her instructions were precise and unspeakably cruel. She did not simply want Snow White dead, she wanted proof, and she wanted that proof delivered in the most grotesque manner possible. The huntsman was commanded to kill the 7-year-old child and return with her lungs and liver. Not her heart, as sanitized versions would later claim, but her breathing organs, and the organ responsible for purifying her blood. The choice was deliberate, symbolic, and rooted in ancient beliefs about consuming the essence of one's enemies. For the queen did not intend to simply look upon these organs as proof of her daughter's death. She planned to have them prepared by the castle cook, boiled with salt, and consumed in a ritualistic act of cannibalism that would, according to medieval folklore, transfer Snow White's beauty and vitality directly into her own body. This was not mere murder. This was a premeditated act of anthropophagic ritual, a mother planning to literally consume her own child's organs in order to steal the beauty that had driven her to such desperate madness. The huntsman, horrified by these instructions but bound by his loyalty to the crown, led the innocent child deep into the dark forest. But when the moment came to drive his blade into her small body, his conscience intervened. He could not bring himself to murder a 7-year-old girl, regardless of his queen's commands. Instead, he told Snow White to run, to flee deep into the wilderness, and never return. Then, to satisfy his queen's bloodlust, he killed a wild boar, carved out its lungs and liver, and presented them to the royal kitchen with the lie that they belonged to the murdered princess. The cook, following the queen's explicit instructions, boiled the organs with salt and presented them to his mistress. And there in the royal dining hall, the queen consumed what she believed to be her own daughter's internal organs, savouring each bite with a conviction that she was absorbing Snow White's youth and beauty into her own aging body. The psychological horror of this scene cannot be overstated. A mother, convinced that she was devouring her own child's flesh, taking pleasure in what she believed to be an act of ultimate maternal betrayal. The corruption of the most fundamental human bond, perverted into an act of cannibalistic ritual, represents a level of darkness that even the Brothers Grimm ultimately could not bear to preserve in its original form. But this was only the beginning. The true story of Snow White had barely begun, and the horrors that lay ahead would make this opening act of maternal cannibalism seem almost merciful by comparison, iful by comparison. Deep in the primordial darkness of the German forest, the child wandered alone. 7 years old, abandoned by the only parent she had ever known, Snow White stumbled through a wilderness that existed beyond the reach of civilization. This was not the enchanted woodland of children's stories, but a place of genuine terror where wild beasts prowled and death lurked behind every shadow. The forest she entered was a realm governed by ancient laws that predated human understanding. It was a place where the normal rules of reality began to fray, where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of spirits grew thin. Here, among the twisted branches and forgotten paths, the child would encounter beings that defied explanation. But the dwarfs she discovered were not the jolly, singing companions of modern retellings. In the original tale, these were mysterious creatures whose very existence raised questions that the sanitized versions preferred to ignore. They were miners, yes, but what exactly were they mining in the depths of the earth? And why did they live in such isolation, hidden from the world of men? The cottage Snow White stumbled upon was impossibly small, everything within it scaled to accommodate beings far shorter than normal humans. The beds were tiny, the chairs were miniature, and the table barely reached the child's waist. But there was something deeply unsettling about the perfection of this hidden home. Every surface gleamed with an unnatural cleanliness. Every object was arranged with mathematical precision. When the 7 inhabitants returned from their subterranean labours, they found the child collapsed across their beds in exhaustion. Their reaction was not the warm welcome of Disney's imagination, but something far more complex and troubling. They agreed to shelter her, but only under the strict condition that she would serve as their housekeeper, cooking, cleaning, and maintaining their isolated domain. This arrangement revealed the harsh economic realities of medieval survival that modern versions carefully avoid. Snow White was not a beloved guest, but an indentured servant, trading her labour for protection in a world where a 7-year-old child had no other options for survival. The dwarfs provided shelter not out of kindness, but as part of a calculated exchange that benefited them as much as it did the fugitive princess. Meanwhile, back in the castle, the queen's satisfaction with her cannibalistic feast was short-lived. The magic mirror, that supernatural oracle of truth, could not be deceived by the consumption of a wild boar's organs. When she next approached its reflective surface and posed her ritual question about beauty, the mirror delivered news that shattered her temporary peace. Snow White still lived. The child whose organs she believed she had devoured was alive, hidden deep in the forest, growing more beautiful with each passing day. The queen's rage at this revelation was absolute. She had committed the ultimate maternal betrayal, had consumed what she thought was her own daughter's flesh, and yet her rival still drew breath. The psychological impact of this discovery cannot be understated. The queen had crossed the most fundamental moral boundary, had violated the deepest taboos of human civilization, and still failed to achieve her goal. Her cannibalistic ritual had been meaningless, her degradation complete, and her enemy remained triumphant. This realization drove her to a level of fury that transcended ordinary human emotion. She would not simply send another assassin or hire professional killers. This had become personal in a way that demanded her direct involvement. The queen would personally ensure Snow White's destruction, even if it meant abandoning the safety of her castle and venturing into the dangerous wilderness herself. But the queen was not merely a jealous woman driven to murder. In the original telling, she possessed supernatural abilities that marked her as something far more dangerous than a simple human antagonist. She was versed in the dark arts of transformation, capable of altering her appearance and assuming different identities. She was a sorceress whose magical powers rivaled those of the enchanted mirror itself. Her first disguise was that of an old peddler woman, bent with age and selling beautiful wares to innocent children. She crafted a corset of such exquisite beauty that no young girl could resist its allure. But this was no ordinary garment. The corset was designed as an instrument of murder, its laces intended to be pulled so tight that they would crush the life from whoever wore it. The queen made her way through the forest, following ancient paths known only to those who practiced the forbidden arts. When she arrived at the dwarf's cottage, she found Snow White alone, as she had calculated. The child, starved for human companionship and beautiful things after months of isolation, could not resist the peddler woman's offerings. The corset was indeed magnificent, its fabric shimmering with threads of gold and silver, its construction so perfect that it seemed almost alive. Snow White allowed the disguised queen to fit the garment around her small frame, never suspecting that her own mother was pulling the laces that would end her life. The queen drew the cords tighter and tighter, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. This was not the distant murder she had ordered from the huntsman, but an intimate act of violence, her mother's hands personally strangling the life from her own child. The psychological horror of the moment was amplified by the physical proximity, the maternal touch transformed into an instrument of death. Snow White collapsed, her breathing stopped, her small body seemingly lifeless on the cottage floor. The Queen, satisfied that she'd finally completed her work, departed through the forest, believing that her daughter's beauty had been permanently extinguished. But when the dwarfs returned from their underground labours, they discovered the unconscious child and immediately recognised the supernatural nature of her condition. They cut the corset's laces with their mining knives, allowing air to return to Snow White's lungs. The child gasped back to life, but the experience had changed her. She now understood that someone wanted her dead badly enough to personally attempt murder. The magic mirror's next revelation sent the Queen into an even deeper rage. Snow White lived still, her beauty undiminished by the assault. The Queen's second failure was more devastating than the first because she had personally carried out the attack. There could be no question of incompetent servants or failed orders. She herself had held the child's life in her hands and somehow allowed it to slip away. The Queen's second disguise was even more elaborate than the first. She transformed herself into a different old woman, this time carrying combs of such intricate beauty that they seemed almost supernatural in their craftsmanship. But these combs had been dipped in the most potent poison known to the dark arts, a toxin so deadly that mere contact with the scalp would bring swift death. Once again she made her way through the treacherous forest paths to the cottage where Snow White lived in isolation. The child, despite her recent brush with death, still possessed the trusting nature of a 7-year-old. When the disguised Queen offered to dress her hair with the beautiful combs, Snow White could not resist the temptation. The moment the poisoned comb touched her scalp, the toxin began its work. Snow White collapsed again, her small body convulsing as the poison spread through her system. The Queen, watching her daughter's apparent death throes, felt a satisfaction that transcended ordinary human emotion. This time, surely the child would not recover. But the dwarfs had grown suspicious of the repeated attacks on their charge. They returned earlier than usual and discovered Snow White poisoned but still clinging to life. Their knowledge of underground minerals and natural remedies allowed them to recognize the signs of poisoning. They removed the contaminated comb and administered antidotes derived from rare plants that grew only in the deepest parts of the forest. Once again, Snow White recovered, but each attack had taken its toll. The repeated attempts on her life were transforming an innocent child into something harder, more wary. The psychological damage of knowing that someone hated her enough to repeatedly attempt murder was changing the very nature of her existence. The Queen's rage at her third failure reached levels that bordered on supernatural fury. The magic mirror's continued declarations of Snow White's superior beauty had become a form of torture, each revelation driving her deeper into a madness that consumed every aspect of her being. She had now personally attempted murder twice, had violated every moral boundary that separated civilization from chaos, and still her 7-year-old daughter lived to mock her efforts. For her final attempt, the Queen crafted the most insidious weapon of all, an apple of such perfect beauty that no living creature could resist its allure, but infused with a poison so subtle and so powerful that it would bring about a death that appeared to be natural sleep. This was not merely another murder attempt, but a masterpiece of supernatural craftsmanship, the culmination of all her dark knowledge and bottomless hatred. The poisoned apple represented the ultimate corruption of maternal love, a mother's final gift to her child, transformed into an instrument of destruction. In its perfect red skin lay concentrated all the Queen's years of jealousy, all her accumulated rage, all her desperate need to be the most beautiful woman in existence. It was, in every sense, a mother's love turned inside out and weaponized against the child who had inspired it. This time, when the Queen approached the cottage in yet another disguise, she knew that failure was not an option. She had exhausted her supernatural abilities, had committed crimes that would damn her soul for eternity, and had sacrificed every shred of her humanity in pursuit of a beauty that remained forever beyond her grasp. The apple in her basket gleamed with an otherworldly perfection, and Snow White's fate hung in the balance of a choice that would echo through the centuries of storytelling that followed. As the disguised queen approached the cottage for what she knew must be her final attempt, she carried with her more than just a poisoned apple. She bore the weight of every failed murder, every act of cannibalistic desperation, every moment when her maternal instincts had been corrupted into something monstrous beyond recognition. The apple gleamed in her basket, like a jewel torn from the heart of evil itself. Snow White, now older but still tragically young, had learned to be cautious. The repeated attempts on her life had taught her to fear strangers, to question gifts, to live in a state of constant vigilance that no child should ever have to endure. But the Queen understood her daughter's psychology better than anyone. She knew that beneath the learned wariness still beat the heart of a child who craved connection, who longed for the simple pleasure of human kindness. The disguise this time was perfect. Not another old woman, but a simple farmer's wife, carrying a basket of the most beautiful fruit ever seen. The Queen had studied her daughter's habits, had learned the patterns of the dwarf's daily departures. She knew exactly when Snow White would be alone, vulnerable, and most susceptible to temptation. When Snow White opened the cottage door, she saw before her a woman whose face radiated such warmth and maternal kindness that her carefully constructed defences began to crumble. This was not the threatening figure of the previous encounters, but someone who reminded her of the mother she had lost, the maternal love she had been denied. The apple the woman offered was beyond description. Its skin gleamed with a perfection that seemed to capture and reflect light in impossible ways. One half was the purest white imaginable, while the other half blazed with a red so deep and rich it seemed to pulse with its own inner fire. It was, quite literally, the most beautiful object Snow White had ever seen. The Queen, understanding her daughter's remaining caution, took a bite from the white half of the apple, demonstrating its apparent safety. She chewed slowly, savouring not the taste but the anticipation of what was to come. The white half was pure, untainted, harmless. Only the red half contained the concentrated essence of death that she had spent weeks perfecting. Snow White watched the woman eat and felt her last defences dissolve. Here was proof of safety, evidence of kindness, a moment of human connection in her isolated existence. When the woman offered her the red half of the apple, Snow White accepted it with the gratitude of a child who had been starved of maternal affection. The moment Snow White's teeth broke the apple's perfect skin, the poison began its inexorable work. But this was not the crude toxin of the comb or the brutal violence of the corset. This poison was a masterpiece of supernatural chemistry, designed to create not death but something far more disturbing, a state that existed between life and death, a condition that would preserve Snow White's beauty in perfect stasis while slowly draining away her life force. Snow White felt the effects immediately. A strange drowsiness overcame her, a heaviness that seemed to seep into her very bones. She tried to speak, to call out for help, but her voice had already been stolen by the poison's embrace. She collapsed to the cottage floor, her breathing becoming so shallow as to be almost imperceptible, her heartbeat slowing to barely detectable rhythms. The Queen watched her daughter's collapse with a satisfaction so profound it transcended ordinary human emotion. Finally, after years of failure, after acts of cannibalism and repeated murder attempts, she had achieved her goal. Snow White lay before her, not quite dead but removed forever from the world of the living. Her beauty was preserved but rendered harmless, locked away in a state that resembled death so closely that no one would question it. When the dwarfs returned that evening, They found Snow White in this death-like slumber and immediately recognized that this attack was different from the others. Their knowledge of antidotes and natural remedies proved useless against this supernatural poison. No amount of cutting laces or removing combs could reverse what had been done. Snow White's condition was beyond their ability to cure. For 3 days, they watched over her motionless form, hoping against hope that she might spontaneously recover as she had before. But as the hours passed, it became clear that this time was different. Snow White's body remained perfectly preserved, her skin retaining its youthful glow, her hair its lustrous shine, but she showed no signs of returning consciousness. The dwarfs faced an impossible decision. They could not bring themselves to bury someone who appeared so vibrantly alive, yet they could not continue to maintain hope for a recovery that seemed increasingly impossible. In their grief and confusion, they crafted a solution that reflected both their love for the child and their inability to accept her apparent death. They constructed a coffin of the finest crystal, transparent on all sides so that Snow White's preserved beauty could be admired even in her death-like state. They placed this crystal tomb on a hilltop overlooking the valley, where it would catch the light of both sunrise and sunset. It became a shrine to impossible beauty, a monument to innocence destroyed by maternal jealousy. But the placement of this crystal coffin introduced elements into the story that would disturb modern audiences in ways the Brothers Grimm could never have anticipated. Snow White's body, preserved in its glass tomb, became an object of fascination for travellers passing through the region. They would climb the hill to gaze upon the beautiful dead child, to marvel at her perfect preservation, to wonder at the story behind her mysterious fate. Among these visitors was a prince whose reaction to the sight of Snow White's apparently lifeless body reveals disturbing psychological undercurrents that the original tale treated as romantic rather than pathological. He became obsessed with the beautiful corpse, returning again and again to stare at the child in her crystal tomb. His desire to possess this perfectly preserved beauty led him to make an offer to the grieving dwarfs that reveals the true darkness lurking beneath the story's surface. The prince requested permission to purchase Snow White's body. He offered the dwarves vast sums of gold in exchange for the crystal coffin and its contents. When they refused, he made increasingly desperate pleas, claiming that he could not live without gazing upon her beauty, that his very existence had become dependent upon possessing this perfectly preserved child. The psychological implications of a grown man's obsession with what appeared to be a dead child introduced themes so disturbing that even the Brothers Grimm, in their later sanitizing efforts, attempted to soften them. But in the original telling, the prince's necrophilic desires were presented not as pathology, but as evidence of Snow White's transcendent beauty, so perfect that it could inspire love even in death. Eventually, the dwarfs, worn down by the prince's relentless pleading, and perhaps sensing something in his devotion that reminded them of their own attachment to the child, agreed to give him the crystal coffin. The prince ordered his servants to carry it back to his castle, where he planned to install it in his private chambers, so that he could gaze upon Snow White's beauty whenever he desired. But during the journey back to the prince's castle, one of the servants stumbled while carrying the heavy crystal coffin. The jolt dislodged the piece of poisoned apple that had remained lodged in Snow White's throat throughout her enchanted sleep. As the apple fragment was expelled, the spell that had held her in its death-like grip was finally broken. Snow White's eyes opened for the first time in months. She found herself in a crystal coffin, being carried by strangers through an unfamiliar landscape, with no memory of how she had come to be there. The psychological trauma of awakening in what appeared to be her own tomb, surrounded by people she had never seen before, was compounded by the realization that an unknown amount of time had passed since her last conscious moment. The prince's reaction to Snow White's resurrection revealed the true nature of his interest in her. Rather than being relieved that the child he claimed to love was alive, he seemed almost disappointed that his perfect, static object of desire had been transformed back into a living, breathing human being with her own will and agency. But Snow White's awakening marked more than just her return to life. It signalled the beginning of the story's final act, a conclusion so brutal and disturbing that it would make everything that had come before seem merciful by comparison. For the Queen's crimes had not gone unnoticed by the supernatural forces that governed justice in the medieval world, and the punishment that awaited her would serve as a warning about the ultimate price of maternal evil that echoed through the darkest corners of folklore for centuries to come. The wedding that followed would not be the celebration of true love that modern audiences expect, but something far more sinister, a ceremony that would serve as both a royal marriage and a public execution, where the boundaries between justice and torture would be obliterated in a display of medieval brutality that defied every modern conception of appropriate punishment. Snow White's wedding was announced throughout the kingdom, and invitations were sent to royalty from every corner of the known world. But this was not the joyous celebration that the sanitized versions would have you believe. The very nature of the ceremony carried with it an undercurrent of vengeance that transformed what should have been a celebration of love into something far more ominous. The Queen, still believing herself to be the most beautiful woman alive, received her invitation with eager anticipation. She had not consulted her magic mirror in the months since Snow White's apparent death, confident that her final poisoning had succeeded where all her previous attempts had failed. The prospect of attending a royal wedding, of displaying her beauty before assembled nobility, filled her with a narcissistic excitement that blinded her to the trap being set. On the morning of the ceremony, she approached her enchanted mirror with the same ritual question that had driven her to such monstrous acts. But the mirror's response shattered her world completely. Not only did Snow White still live, but she was about to be crowned as the most beautiful bride in the kingdom. The Queen's years of murder, cannibalism, and supernatural assault had accomplished nothing except to delay the inevitable triumph of her daughter's superior beauty. The psychological impact of this final revelation drove the Queen into a state of madness so complete that she could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare. She had sacrificed everything, had committed acts so heinous that they defied human comprehension, and yet Snow White remained victorious. The futility of her crimes crashed down upon her with the weight of absolute despair. But rather than fleeing, rather than accepting defeat, the Queen's madness compelled her toward one final confrontation. She would attend this wedding. She would look upon her daughter's triumph with her own eyes. She would force herself to witness the ultimate proof of her failure, even if it destroyed what remained of her sanity. So the Queen attended her daughter's wedding, and there she faced the punishment that medieval justice reserved for the most heinous crimes. Red-hot iron shoes, heated until they glowed like embers from hell itself, were brought forth with tongs and placed before her. She was forced to step into them and dance until she dropped dead, her flesh searing, her screams echoing through the great hall as the assembled nobility watched in horrified fascination. This is the true story of Snow White, not a tale of innocent love conquering evil, but a brutal examination of maternal jealousy, cannibalistic ritual, and medieval justice that would make modern audiences flee in terror. The Brothers Grimm understood that some stories are too dark for civilized consumption, too honest about human nature's capacity for evil. The next time you see a child watching Disney's sanitized version, remember what lies beneath. Remember the 7-year-old girl whose own mother tried to eat her organs, whose beauty inspired attempted murder, whose wedding became an execution. Remember that our most beloved fairy tales were built upon foundations of horror that we have chosen to forget, sanitized nightmares that reveal more about human darkness than we are comfortable admitting. Some stories, it seems, are simply too dangerous to tell in their original form, but now you know the truth that was buried beneath centuries of careful editing and commercial packaging. The question that remains is whether we are brave enough to confront the authentic darkness that lurks at the heart of our most cherished tales.